lost contact. Sorry.
It has become the norm for media companies to not care whether the news they publish is uncertain, is shady, or is in many instances fake news, untrue, and dangerously misleading. On our bench, we seek to change this. In my speech, I'm going to talk to you first about the danger of misleading information. Second, I'm going to talk about how we get better reporting and better news from our model. But first, I'm just going to outline our model. Okay, so first we say, obviously this would be a claim-based system. Similar to a tort of like defamation, right? A claim would be brought by a party, a court would work out if the information had been was correct or not, and then a significant financial penalty would be applied if the news media company was found to be liable, and it would be enough of a penalty to punish such a large and wealthy organisation. And we think like there would be quite a high bar, so if something was found to be extremely well researched and fact-checked, and it was just like random occurrence that no one could ever foresee that it was untrue, we think they wouldn't be found guilty for that. Okay. But if it was like, but for other things, we think it would be fairly likely to be found guilty. And we think that like lots of parties would bring in individuals, but also watchdog groups, charities, organisations, people with general interest in making sure that the news is like not misleading and is clear and correct. Okay. So that's what our model would look like. No, thank you. So first, let's talk about the danger of misleading. So obviously, misleading information. So obviously, this case will focus a lot about fake news and overall misleading information. But we think it's first important to acknowledge the damage to an individual. If a story about you or someone is published that's just incorrect or wrong, it can be very damaging as it's spread far and wide. It destroys your reputation, in some places your life, and like there's very little recompense for you to get back at them because media companies are so large and powerful without this like financial checking system. It's hard for a lot of people to feel that there is a system to get back at them. And we think examples are like Fox News like running and supporting a story that some guy who was the survivor of a gun massacre in America is actually a false flag operation actor. We think it's things like that that we can target and that has actually been reported on in the States. So looking more at fake news now, no thank you. We think that generally fake news, the danger with fake news and things like that is first it uninforms voters, right? It means that when people are discussing things, because the media is spreading false information that's generally picked up by other media outlets and spread across, it means that the debate people have when they engage in political rhetoric isn't a debate about the facts, it's a debate about dramatic rhetoric and clickbait articles, like saying that the migrant caravan is made up of hundreds and thousands of like wanton criminals, when really there should be a discussion about the more nuanced, accurate facts of the situation, right? But continuing this, we also think it pushes debates and debates in the mainstream into extremism, because first the kinds of fake news that are put out by media companies tend to be things to attract views, so they're often clickbait, they're often dramatic, and they're not correct, so that pushes into extremism. But further, we also think that when people feel that their news media is lying to them constantly or not telling the right information, they often go to other sources to get the correct information, sources that try and tell people they're correct and like they inform voters properly. But actually extremists themselves, because they come from their own very strong political leanings and have their own like information that they're spreading that they think that they say is the truth, and so we think that pushes people into extremism when they think that even their like mainstream news companies can't be trusted. So they seek out information further on. Yes.
The biggest source of lies in the US is President Trump, who covers up his lying by claiming that the media organizations who debunk him are fake news. How do you think that the creation of this mechanism affects people's perceptions of the veracity of media companies?
Well, I think it'll bring restored trust in them, right? When they see that they're the ones who are being investigated and they're the ones that are being like worked out whether it's correct. When a court literally says like you are correct, we think it's more trust, like going to restore trust and show that Donald Trump is the one who's in the wrong, right? And he's the crazy one. But continuing on this, so that leads to extremism, it leads to uninformed debate, and in like occurrences, it it actually sways how people think about political elections, like under the Brexit debate, right, or Trump's election. Fake news was perpetrated by both the left and right, and it meant that when people came to the polls, they weren't coming with informed views, they were coming with ignorance, they were misleading information, and it actually hurt people, it hurt their political opinions, and it hurt the kind of debate they could have had. So why do we think we get better reporting? Well, first we think the financial burden brought against the media company every time they tell a lie or spread something obviously fake will be quite considerable, and we think media companies now unnecessarily mean they're going to have to institute more rigorous fact-checking, right? They're going to have to get outside confirmation that something is correct, they're going to have to spend more time looking at it, and we think this will slow down the pace of news. Because what happens a lot today is one company writes a story, then other media companies just copy and paste it and put it online. The Herald does it all the time, right? And so that means false information can be spread very quickly, and it's never slowed down, and media companies never stop and go, hold on, that's not quite correct. We think when they're required, they have a burden on them if they do not do this, they're going to slow down, they're going to fact check, and they're going to make sure that their sources are actually accurate. Now, what does this lead to? First, it means that we think we have better reporting in general, because no longer can you rely on rhetoric to make an argument. Breitbart can't say, all immigrants are terrible because they're all rapists and murderers, right? Because that's obviously not correct. Instead, they have to use analysis and explain why they think people would be dangerous to the economy or people should not be allowed into the country. And we think that just lowers the extremism and actually brings debate back to informed settings. But further on this, we also think it restores trust in media companies, right? Because when people see that there's a rigorous system that examines what media companies say, they're more likely to turn away from extremist sources that they've only gone to because they feel the mainstream media can't trust them, and they actually likely restore their trust in mainstream media, which we think is a good thing, because we think people need to be informed and they need to trust their media sources. Otherwise, they simply turn to people like Trump who say, I'm the only one, I'm the only one who actually knows the whole truth, I'm the only one saying the correct thing. But when media companies can say that too, that restores people's faith in the system and it turns them away from extremist views like Trump. But we also think that offers people a way to discern what's correct in a world of lies. Because currently, say Fox says something false, and CNN says, well, Fox said something false. Well, Fox's viewers exist in an echo chamber, right? And so they're more likely to think, oh, CNN's just the lefty hippies saying that Fox is wrong. And the same thing happens when CNN tells a lie and Fox calls them out, right? Then CNN's people say it's just Fox being wrong. But we think when there's an independent system which people trust and which anyone can bring a claim to, it's not controlled by the left wing, it's not controlled by the right wing, we think people are more likely to trust that that is the correct information that has been discerned. And when everyone is having a debate on the same set of facts, and when everyone is making their analysis of the same set of facts, we think not only is that better for the individual who isn't targeted by media companies and doesn't feel there's no recompense if they tell lies about them, but it's better for the political discussion as a whole. It drags people away from extremism, it drags people away from lies, and it means when you go to vote in the polls, you know how many migrants were in that caravan.
I take the speaker for a speech. I'd like to invite up the leader of the opposition.
Here's the thing, panel. We tell you that there are very few genuine media organisations who do not care whether or not the things that they publish are true. We tell you that journalists already have an incentive to fact-check their stories, that their aim is to report the truth. While obviously there also exists media who deliberately dwell in fake news, we tell you that those organisations will continue to do so, where they may be forced onto other platforms, and that the people who currently read those sources of news will just continue to read them in other places. Ultimately then, what we tell you is that this just adds an incentive onto like media organizations who already try to do the right thing that makes them like more likely to act in ways that we think are actually bad for the proliferation of good news overall. What am I going to talk to you about in this debate? First of all, I'm going to develop my introduction a bit more and tell you why we don't think that the problem with fake news is what our opening government told us that it was. Then I'm going to deal with some of like the quick, smaller points from OG's speech. Then I'm going to tell you why we think it's particularly important to prevent the way that government can, that like more politicized institutions can intervene in really like critical liberal institutions, and then talk about the impossibility of knowing what is captured by this moot. Okay then, what's actually the problem? As I tell you, right, we tell you that on one hand, there are reputable news organizations like the New York Times, like The Guardian, like stuff.co.nz, that may not always be the best news sources ever, but definitely as journalists, they are journalists because they want to report truthful stories to their media, and they have an absolute incentive, not only to themselves and their professional reputation, but to the reputation of their newspaper as well, to do a good job and to engage in that story properly, right? They absolutely do care, contrary to what we heard from opening government, right? Then, of course, there is also like places like Breitbart, right, who definitely do not care. We tell you that if you currently are part of Breitbart, and Breitbart is no longer able to like engage in the current things they do, they're going to find those loopholes, right? So maybe they write things called opinion pieces that actually just sneak in terrible fake news into those stories. Or if their case is more like rigorous than that, Breitbart moves to 4chan, right? They move somewhere else that isn't technically a media organization where fake news is still able to proliferate. The people who like engage in Breitbart are also very likely to engage in those kind of platforms, or certainly will if Breitbart asks them to. What is then, given that it's not most media organizations, what is then the problem in this debate? We say the problem with fake news is actually like politicians being more and more willing to lie, and newspapers less and less willing to like provide critical analysis on those lies, right? And we tell you that this actually exacerbates the problem, because currently politicians get away with their lies because they're like, no, it's the news that is fake, and they push it on to like the fake news spreading lies about them, right? We tell you this exemplifies their ability to do this, right? You are able to discredit a news organization by reference to the fact there is a lawsuit against them. How these lawsuits ever come into existence is still unclear to me, like who brings the lawsuit, but never mind, we'll just move on from that. Like, we just don't think therefore that there are like many lawsuits that are ever likely to actually happen, but we also think that like to the extent that they do, it just reinforces that narrative used by politicians, which is the real problem. What we think is good is that news media organizations are willing to call out those lies in like more harsher language, but that's like a different issue that is not part of this debate. Okay, quickly then, let's tidy up a few things, right? Keir was like, oh look, there's a really big damage to people's individual reputation if a bad story is told about them. Sue them for defamation. We already have a thing that already literally exists to cover that exact problem, right? Use it, we think that's totally fine. Other news organizations can say that you lie. Second then, do you get better trust in the system? No, as I explained before, you're more likely to believe the news is fake, right? Because there is a growing number of people, particularly in the US, who are buying into Trump and other Republican analysis that CNN and those organizations are out to get the Republicans. They are evil, they lie, they are liberal, they're captured by the Democratic agenda. You buy into that at the point where like you bring this lawsuit against them. We think people don't follow lawsuits very closely. All they'll really hear is that CNN is bad, they're being sued. Like, that's particularly bad as well. We also think you don't change uninformed voters. We think you're still able to use terrible rhetoric, right, in the language of opinions. Like, more vague language, right? Like, lots of immigrants are criminals, right? Like, unclear if that is a misleading statement, depending on what lots means. We'll come back to that in a second. Okay, then. Yes, Sam.
Donald Trump often retweets Fox News and uses the legitimacy of the media company to asperge his lies. How then is stopping the source not leading to a better informed public coming out of Donald Trump's mouth?
Okay, no, we think that Donald Trump lies all the time without the aid of Fox News, right? And that often their lies kind of he's the one who leads the lies and Fox News publishes it and he talks about it that way. We don't think that that is actually how Donald Trump is able to lie. Okay, first point we want to talk about here. We say political events show us that previous non-partisan institutions can be compromised and used for political purposes, and we think it is particularly important that we do not allow, like, very crucial liberal institutions like the media to be controlled in any meaningful way by partisan institutions, particularly crucial in the US, where their court systems are very, very heavily politicized. What we tell you is that as nations sometimes do slide towards a liberalism, it is particularly crucial that the media is there to stop it, that the media can say what they need to. We think that where you have the risk of like partisan organizations getting involved in that, you risk that being used politically to stifle the other side's political facts, and we think that is particularly damaging in this debate. The politicization of the world should be brought in mind, right? How do you think they're like able to engage in, like, use the vagueness of this moot to do that to their advantage, right? First of all, we tell you it's very hard in this debate to actually know what is captured, right? We think, for instance, it was unclear from their model if you yourself have to like know that your claim, that the thing that you said is true or not, or like what standard of fact checking you actually have to engage in, right? We think that what this actually leads to, right, is a couple of, also in terms of misleading statements, we think it's very difficult to know something's misleading, right? Like, how do you know how people psychologically react to your statement that something, that like significant numbers of migrants in the caravan are criminals? Like, that's only misleading if people think significant means 50% and not a smaller but still significant percentage, right? So we think it's very hard to know. What does that mean? It means that it's easy to use this to political advantages, right, in that sense. But also, it means that we think the good news medias that we told you exist have perverse incentives, right? They're going to slow down and overcheck and overthink their media, which means they'll be slower in reporting, and in the meantime, rumours and those bad media that still exist in like the underground of official media sites will perpetuate rumours in their absence. That's make people less informed. That is worse. Very proud to oppose.
Thank the Speaker for the speech. I now welcome up the Deputy Prime Minister.
While it's true that our model might not be perfect, it's important when thinking about this debate to think about the comparative that we heard from that side of the House. Because while there are flaws in our system and the court won't always perfectly judge what is possible, currently, Keir gave you a problem that fake news and misinformation is severely misleading the public, is leading to extreme partisan and extremists. That needs to be solved, and what we just heard from Siobhan's speech was 7 minutes of why our model might not be perfect, but nothing to defend the status quo and why that would be something that we should ever try to achieve. What am I going to talk about in this speech? The first thing I'm going to do is actually look at what fake news is and how pervasive and how changing it is. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the harm to individuals, which Siobhan did not go into at all. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about perceptions of the media, before finally talking about how we change reporting. Firstly, what does fake news look like? The third thing is, in lots of media companies, there is incredibly false information that gets spread. Keir brought you one example, but that also looks like the Pizzagate scandal that claimed that prominent Democrats were infiltrated in pedophile rings. That is literal false information that has no backing, but because media companies like Breitbart, who have some air of legitimacy, say them, people believe them in large amounts. But even on the less extreme side, talking about how in the Brexit debate, the NHS funding scandal that happened, where people said that all the funding would come back, in that situation, exit polls showed that that was a pertinent issue on people and how they decided how they voted with. Those key facts that aren't actually true resonate in people and give them justification to buy into these types of biases, and those are why they're so damaging. So sure, we're not going to perfectly solve it in all situations, but even in small situations, like for instance, just making sure that people couldn't put the NHS slide and publish it around, would be incredibly important. We think that shouldn't be put a great. No, thank you. The second thing we heard from them then, in terms of what it looked like, is they said that, well, what happens now is media companies just don't report because they're too scared to do it and that would harm democracy. The third thing to say is, we actually think that slower news is better news, and we gave you examples at Keir as to why that was important. We told you when it was slower, it was more likely to be checked and careful and good news, but also if you have to check multiple sources, you're likely to get a fuller picture of the story and have a more comprehensive take. That is good, and that means that individual news sources will also be able to have their different takes through their different sources and get better news. And rumours don't spread in the time it takes to check that, right? We're talking about now taking like 4 or 5 hours rather than 20 minutes to check a story and put it up. We don't think people dramatically have all these rumours creeping to Reddit and that time. That sense. The final thing that she did is she model bashed and was like, oh, it's so vague, how are we going to know what the standard is? Well, Keir told you pretty explicitly, it's a negligent standard. If you show that you have sufficiently checked, through sources or other things, that's fine. But also, we told you that individuals will take claims, watchdogs will take claims. Model bashing wasn't good in that space. Okay. I don't have to spend much time on individuals because Siobhan didn't really rebut any of that. But we say that there is a power imbalance that exists between individuals and media companies, which means that when an individual is severely misrepresented, they have no recourse of action because they do not have a media company in order to challenge the sections coming out. So for instance, if you publish that someone was into racist jackets and the media publish it around, then you wouldn't be able to push back against that and say that you weren't in that. There's incredible harm to people, I assume, that have those types of persuasions or don't have those types of persuasions. We think there would need to be more response to how that is damaging. I'll take one for closing.
Oh, brilliant. So most of the fake news that turned up in 2016 was from small organisations like 4chan and Facebook groups and Facebook pages and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Do you propose to sue the hacker known as 4chan or what?
We probably can't, right? But we can still significantly take a big portion of fake news and the people that proliferate that fake news to average everyday consumers in this. Okay, firstly, perceptions of the media. They say this really dramatically harms the media's perception, that's bad for democracy. The third thing to say is, the reverse is also true, which is what Keir responded to in a POI that Siobhan didn't pick up on. And the fact that if you're approved that the fact is true, then the media company buys legitimacy out of that, and that is good for ensuring that media has trust and etc. But also, it is just true in lots of cases, although Trump overplays it, that there is a shitload of fake news around. Stuff is a bad organisation that publishes bad news. CNN publishes horrible stories, and at the point where they are forced to change the way that they report and become better news organisations, the public will trust them more and credibility will flow from that. So sure, at the moment it might be oh, this means that the news might be fake, but in large instances they are. We give them the incentive to change, which means that you get that type of reporting come down. Thirdly, echo chambers already exist, which means that people are probably going to believe in their partisan news source anyway. That's not a significant new harm of people not trusting the news. But finally, like I said in my POI, often the news is what gives politicians legitimacy in order to make claims that are not true and are not fact-checked by their policymakers. When they're able to say that a large news company said this, I'm just repeating this, buyers trust that. When there's less of that happening in the world, it is more likely that politicians will make less false statements. Maybe Trump might still, but he's an outlier. Normal politicians generally like to say facts in that sense. Okay, let's talk about changes to reporting. We gave you incentives to how they change. We told you it's more likely that you check your facts more because you need to make sure that you reach a negligent standard. We said it's more likely that you wouldn't go publish a story without checking it from another one because there's a freeloader problem that exists in the media. What were their responses? Their first responses was, well, journalists are really altruistic and good, so it's all right because we can just trust them. The first thing I can say is, even in situations where individual journalists have that type of moral ethic, it's likely the editor won't, because the editor wants to earn lots of money and has shareholders to be accountable, etc. What that means is the pressure comes from above to these reporters who push out so many articles a day, and that means they do not have the time or the effort to fact check them. When you now punish the people on top for not letting their reporters do their job properly, it's much more likely that these good reporters are properly able to do what they want. They just currently can't. The second thing is loopholes will exist. So you're doing opinion. The third thing is, opinion is really powerful when it relies on facts. So for instance, opinion journalism that relied on the false caravan people fact was the most important opinion. So you devalue the amount of opinion. But secondly, moving to Reddit, it's sure, that might happen in some instances, right? One, lots of people don't go on Reddit, particularly older people who use media sources. Those are the people that vote in influence elections. But also, we think that media companies have a certain sort of legitimacy that Reddit cannot get. When you are a reporter, even if that's not legitimacy, that influences people more. And that's when you get people actually voting on decisions, and that's it. At the end of the day, not only do we get more thorough, better reporting, we also get reporting and an informed populace and actually able to decide just find them.
I thank the Speaker for his speech and invite up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Since taking office, President Trump has lied over 5,000 times. In the same period of time, I suspect that you could count the number of false stories published by major reputable media organizations on one hand. The problem with fake news, as we perceive it, comes almost exclusively from fake statements propagated by politicians, not from those published by media companies. Opening government's model misses the source of the problem with fake news, and it erodes the ability of media organizations to act as a reputable check on the lies of politicians. What am I going to do in this speech? Firstly, I'm going to talk about whether a problem exists at all. We deny that it does. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why it's dangerous to create such an organization, building on some material from Siobhan. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about trust in the media and the speed of reporting, and then I'm going to contribute a split point about small media organizations going bankrupt if they ever face a suit like this. Firstly, we deny categorically that a problem exists. We deny that there is widespread publication of deliberate falsehoods among major media organizations like CNN, like the New York Times, and like Fox. Now, of course, there are Breitbarts on the internet that do publish routinely misleading information. However, at the point at which you make it financially unsustainable for them to do so, they just migrate to other platforms like 4chan, at which point they are not technically a media organization, so the mechanism set up by opening government cannot check them.
Fine.
At that point, the problem is worse, right? Because then any semblance of constraints on the facts disappears, right? Breitbart is really bad, but it's still much better than the sort of completely unverified bullshit that gets published on internet forums. At the point at which the users of those platforms migrate to those forums once those platforms are shut down, the problem of the proliferation of fake news gets much worse. Does Fox publish misleading and false information? We deny that Fox publishes repeated falsehoods, and we challenge them to produce many examples of this. But let's suppose that Fox is the only mainstream media organization that does publish routine falsehoods. Just imagine the existence of a supposedly nonpartisan organization that exclusively pursues lawsuits against one media organization which 40 to 60% of the American public routinely watch. Like, that disproportionate focus on Fox would completely compromise the supposed nonpartisanship of this organization and make it impossible for it to achieve its purpose. Fox does, of course, publish misleading information, but part of our point is that it's almost impossible to define objectively in a court of law what information is misleading and what is not. Because in order to know whether a particular story is misleading, you need to know the psychological reactions that it produces in people, and that's not something that's like empirically verifiable for a court of law, right? So if Fox says, like, significant numbers of migrants in the caravan have committed crimes, does that mean 5% or does that mean 50%? Who knows? It depends on the reactions of the people who were watching. That's not something that the court of law can verify, so not something their court can effectively enforce against. Yes?
A court of law's job is literally to be a fact finder to determine what is fact. Why can't they then do the job on this
But
area
what are
for
you
them?
going to do? Like, poll all Fox watchers and ask whether they thought that significant numbers, like, meant in percentage terms? And, like, what incentive do those, like, watchers of Fox News have to tell the truth if they know that if they report something that's literally false, then the court of law is going to find their favorite media organization, right? That's just not verifiable. Okay, so we deny that there's a problem, or insofar as there is a problem, we deny that their solution solves it. Okay, what then is the first substantive point that Siobhan brought you? The lesson from recent political events, particularly in the US, is that previously nonpartisan institutions can be compromised very quickly and very unpredictably. The post of Attorney General, which just 2 years ago was independent, has now been compromised and has now been taken over by an explicitly political actor. The response to this recognition that nonpartisan institutions can quickly be compromised, we say, is to limit the power of government to interfere with political events. It's fundamentally dangerous to set up an institution with the power to regulate and censor news media at the point at which we don't know whether in 2 or 3 years, or 10 years, or 20 years, that media organization is going to be compromised by partisan actors and used by them to pursue their political rivals. It's just too dangerous to condone, particularly when we deny that a problem exists in the first place. No. Okay, let's talk about trust in the media. So we tell you that politicians are their primary source of lies, and it's crucially the role of media organizations to check them. So it's really important whether people trust media organizations when they debunk the lies of politicians. We told you that the creation of this sort of mechanism confirms the narratives of corrupt politicians like Trump, who are the main source of these falsehoods, and who defend their falsehoods by saying that media is fake news. The response was that this restores faith in media where false claims are prosecuted. But just like think for a second about an organization like the New York Times, which publishes literally hundreds of pieces of information from dozens of journalists each day. It is inevitable, just by statistical chance, that some pieces of those information at some point will be false, which allows someone to pursue a lawsuit against the New York Times. Now, the majority of people won't follow the progress of that lawsuit. It might be likely that the lawsuit will fail. But now, every time, instead of just saying, instead of Trump saying the New York Times is fake news, he can say the New York Times has 4 pending lawsuits against it for reporting false claims, and its supporters won't bother to actually investigate the nature of those lawsuits or whether they've been successful. That completely compromises people's trust in all of these mainstream reputable news organizations, and that's really bad on their side of the house. No. Okay, let's talk about slowing down the speed of reporting, whether that's actually a bad thing. Sorry, we think it's a very bad thing. Look, in an interconnected world with access to the internet, information about events spreads very, very quickly through unverified sources. So it's crucial that media organizations try to report as rapidly as possible in order to debunk fake information that spreads. So for example, if any of you are on Twitter, you'll often see that in the wake of a shooting or a terrorist attack or a natural disaster, there are lots of prominent Twitter users with lots of followers that tweet unverified information about what happened. Now, the crucial thing is that media organizations, which are trying to report as rapidly as possible, rapidly debunk or confirm the claims of those Twitter users. At the point at which media organizations are deliberately waiting 2 days, the things that people see on Twitter become imprinted in their minds. They don't bother to come back and read about the incident 2 days after it's already happened and they've already heard about it, and fake news spreads a lot more because it's spread by unverified sources. Finally, small media organizations like small local newspapers. These have a crucial role in delivering people information about their local area, but also their decline due to financial problems is part of why people subscribe to supposedly problematic media organizations like Fox. Now, if you're a small institution with 5 journalists, again, it's inevitable that at some point you will accidentally publish something false, or maybe you even hire a reporter who's actively malicious and publishes something false, and the editor doesn't have enough resources or enough money or enough time to check on that. One single lawsuit from this mechanism can destroy a local newspaper, and at the point at which this mechanism consistently exists, that will rapidly speed up the decline of these local news organizations and remove their crucial role in society. Extremely proud to oppose.
I take the speaker for this speech and invite up the members of the government.
In our parents' generation and in our grandparents' generation, people would use mainstream media to tether them to reality, right? They would turn on the news at 6, or they would flick open one of the mainstream papers, and that would tell them like what's happening and why, and together as a society they would learn what's happening and why from those same sources, right? And that's what's really important in today's debate that so far has been missed, right? That shared sense of reality used to create a more harmonious society where people could actually have discussions about things, right? So this debate was never about like 4chan and a bunch of other weird internet sites that the majority of people never go on anyway, right? It was always going to be about these mainstream media outlets and how we can best restore faith in them so we can get back to a society where we have a shared sense of reality, right? Okay, I'm going to talk about like why this is really important, the mechanisms for like how this makes people trust the media, and then like the effects and why that's really good. But before I get into that, let's talk about what we heard from opening opposition. Okay. Firstly, they said, look, most media organisations are pretty good, so what's the problem? That's completely missed the point, right? In terms of its public perception of the media, that's what's important here, okay? Faith in the media is at an all-time low, right? We know that, and that's despite all of their claims about how great the media is currently, right? So the question is, how can we get people to trust the media again? That means we need a change, and we think we get this through this model, right? The next thing was like, okay, well, places like Breitbart will just go on 4chan now, and now, you know, they're not technically a news organisation, so you can't do anything. As I flagged in my reduction, this is just ridiculous, because we're really glad places like Breitbart effectively exile themselves to 4chan, where the majority of people will never follow them anyway, because they just don't want to go to sites like that. Next, they talked about how we want media to check politicians. This kind of stuff all just falls out. How do you get media to check politicians? You get people to trust the media again, right? And that's exactly what we're trying to do with our model. Next, they talked about okay, well, two things. Firstly, a ridiculous point about like how like Trump's the biggest liar, right? And so now he's just going to say, oh, well, now the New York Times has lawsuits pending and people will just believe him. First of all, Trump already says this, right? He says, I'm going to sue the New York Times and they have things pending because I'm the one who's doing it, right? And the only people who give a shit about that are hardcore Trump fans anyway. The second thing here is well, they just then they were like, okay, well, they won't be able to criticise politicians anymore. The only thing that this proves is that news media is going to be incentivised to have a clearer demarcation between opinion and news media and news reporting, right? And we think that's a really good thing. Lastly, to say here in terms of this gives a whole bunch of model bashing, as it's hard to determine what misleading and objective truth is. Follow that to its logical conclusion. Courts would never be able to do anything, right? They're finders of fact. That's the point. Okay, let's get on to substantive then. In terms of, we think that people, before the advent of this new kind of media, right, had a shared sense of reality, right? Because they were getting their news, they were getting their fact set from the same site. So they were getting it from the news, or they were getting it from established media organisations like the New York Times or whatever, right? We say on this side of the house that the reason why we are unable to have any kind of meaningful debate in society, particularly in places like the US, that isn't just Ben Shapiro, Rex liberal, right? The only reason why the current stuff exists is because people aren't operating at all from the same fact set, right? They're just the reason why people are it seems like people from the right and the left are operating in different worlds. It's because they literally are, right? They're actually getting entirely different fact sets and a sense of reality, right? And if two different parties have operating from entirely different fact sets, you can't have any kind of meaningful debate or conversation, right? We want to go back to a society where you can have a diversity of opinion, but you don't have a diversity of realities. Okay, let's talk about mechanisms then. Why we think that this kind of stuff will lead to greater trust in the media. But before I go, I'm closing.
Do you think a small media watchdog will ever be able to afford to sue a large company like Fox or News Corp?
Okay, well, that's just a problem of funding, right? Just give these organisations enough power to do what you want them to do, right? I mean, ridiculous point. Okay. The point here is that, in terms of mechanisms, we want to There are a number of mechanisms. Firstly, it was canvassed quite well by our opening in terms of like, if you have this, and disincentivizes media from publishing quickly, right? So they go back and they actually like do their research, and we think that's really good. Secondly, however, a really important mechanism to talk about here is that people see mistruths published in the media being punished, right? That's really important because when people see mistruths being punished, it does a number of things. Firstly, it shows them that the media takes it seriously when they muck up, and then they're prepared to not only do some kind of meaningless apology, but actually do some kind of reparation there. It shows that that the media does think that there's a clear demarcation between truth and untruth, right? And lastly, it clearly shores up trust in the media because people now trust that the media doesn't just have to self-regulate themselves, but there is some kind of other body that is going to regulate them. What does this mean then in terms of effects and why it's really good? Okay. We see that right now, with the current landscape in terms of people getting different fact sets and different realities, it does a number of bad things. Firstly, it causes people to believe things that are inherently not true, right? So that's like Trump supporters believing that there are literally millions of undocumented workers who go out and vote illegally and can turn elections. It makes them believe things like that. Secondly, it makes them not want to believe things that are true and stick their head in the sand with things like global warming, right? It means they inherently don't want to believe things that are actually true. Lastly, we say that it's actually really inherently stressful for people not to have some kind of anchor on reality, right? In terms of it's really inherently stressful in today's society that people are constantly second guessing everything, right? In terms of they're is this true? Is this some kind of weird false flag? What are the incentives of this media doing that? We say not only is it inherently really stressful, but it means it's the reason why people are prepared to buy into weird conspiracy theories and all of that kind of stuff, which is really harmful. Proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and I'd like to invite up the member for the opposition.
I have my glasses. Can I speak from here? Will anyone be offended? Alright.
I will to move further away from me.
Sorry, I'm very blind.
Just speak very loudly.
At Extension, we're going to discuss how this gives large, well-funded media organisations a legal tool in order to oppress their competition, in order to shut down the ability of small companies to be able to put out high-risk, high-reward stories. The best example of this is Newsroom. Newsroom has been able to establish a place in the media environment by talking about very high-risk stories, stuff around the Me Too movement in terms of the Labour Party sex scandals and in terms of the Jamie Lee Ross story. It is not inconceivable in a world where large media organisations wanted to shut down potential competition that they would use this as a legal tool to shut down those companies or at the very least drown them in legal dollars. And that came to the heart of why I asked the POI earlier, right? Because does anyone really believe in this room that a small media watchdog organisation that they want to give magic money to from the government will be able to afford to sue Fox News? Fox News airs in over 200 jurisdictions. I know, because I watch Fox News, right? The point is that these are enormous companies with enormous amounts of money that are likely to be able to drown your opposition and legal fees. That means they won't get their benefits. I'm going to talk about the model, I'm going to talk about lies and the comparative, I'm going to talk about high-risk stories, and then I'm going to talk about small companies. First to the model. Keir wanted to say there will be a high bar. The problem is that this is incredibly subjective questions in complex law. There are questions over journalistic integrity and the treatment of sources, right? Problem. Media sources are unlikely to want to testify. Why? Because often in really complicated and difficult cases, sources only talk to journalists on the basis of anonymity. Are they likely to go to court, guys? That makes things difficult for people to be able to defend themselves against questions of their journalistic integrity, especially in instances, I would say, sexual assault or political extremism. But also, there are likely to be difficult complications with laws around, say, BORA in New Zealand, but other bills of rights around the world that aim to protect freedom of speech, and aim to protect the rights of journalistic organisations. There was just a case the other day around defamation law in the courts over whether media should have defamation limited on the law. This law is incredibly complicated. But lastly, in order for them to get their benefits in this case, there's going to have to be a sufficiently low bar that you can get past these areas of subjectivity and really punish media organisations. It's going to be very difficult for people to be able to defend themselves. So, let's talk about who's likely to sue. I said it's unlikely that a small media watchdog is going to be able to afford to sue Fox News, right? That's because A, they're very, very large companies, but B, there's unlikely to be political capital to fund media watchdog organisations millions and millions of dollars a year when voters say that that's a trade-off between, funding healthcare in the local school down the road. Who's seriously going to vote for the political party that says we're campaigning on $50 million to sue Fox News? It's insanity, right? These organisations are very small. In reality, they are likely to be, even if they would otherwise be successful, drowned in lawyers and drowned in discovery. And note that this is extremely complicated law, it's subjective, and like they said at closing government, is in an instance where there are alternative sets of facts, where people legitimately and honestly believe different notions of the world. That means you're going to be able to drown the other side in complicated subjective discovery, correspondence between journalists, and all sorts of carry on. What that means is it's going to be incredibly difficult for small organisations to use it effectively. Who will use this? And this goes to the heart of our extension material. Large media companies. Large media companies have both the capacity and incentive to use this law. Their incentive is that if they can somehow denigrate the credibility of competing media organisations and use that to achieve greater market share, or just simply impose significant legal costs, the kinds of financial Ragnarok that Keir wanted to talk about in his case, that might lead them to, say, limit the size of their news organisation, hire fewer journalists, be able to cover fewer geographic regions. That all allows media organisations to capture large market share. So there's a strong incentive on large media companies to use it. Demonstrable lies. We live in a hyper-competitive media environment where if Fox News reports on Pizzagate, they are likely to, and do, get slammed by MSNBC for doing that. What are the incentives to not tell demonstrable lies? A few things. Viewers, right? First, maybe some people like me will continue to watch Fox News regardless, right? But at the very least, if you convey some kind of denigration on their credibility, people might just say turn the TV off, even if I don't go and watch CNN or MSNBC or other liberal crap. Or I might just watch Fox less, right? Because I view that the marginal benefit of watching it falls as a result of their credibility. But secondly, you also have to be able to convince journalists to come work at your news organisation, who presumably do care about your credibility and ability to do good work by virtue of them desiring to enter the industry. But lastly, you also want to win Pulitzers and stuff like that, right? I'll tell you very briefly.
The Environmental Defence Society is able to deal with the most complex law of resource management law and take massive cases against huge conglomerates as a watchdog group. Why could that same society not exist in this area of law?
Seems unlikely. I haven't heard of them. And BP still fucked up the Gulf of Mexico. They clearly haven't been that successful. Right, let's talk about high-risk journalistic stories. There are a certain class of public interest stories that are high-risk, high-reward. Stuff like Me Too stories and stories about the woman at the New York Times whose name I can't remember, who's doing the Caliphate podcast and does lots of really good journalistic work, has complicated sources and that sort of stuff. Other stories around political extremism. Doesn't inherently get subjective, and it's difficult to have absolute faith in the truth of those stories for a variety of reasons. One, you have a limited number of sources, right? Because of the Jamie Lee Ross example, right? That newsroom story was based on talking to 4 women. It's very difficult to be able to talk to hundreds of people and totally back that up with credibility, right? So it might be easy to go to court and say that it was made up, right? The other thing is it's very difficult to establish trust with close sources in instances of, say, Me Too instances or political extremism. But also, those people who are the people likely to be sources have a very strong interest in anonymity, right? So what's the problem? Researchers now become significantly more risk averse because they're scared of competing media organisations drowning them in lawyers. Note that the disincentive effect doesn't just have to be where it is demonstrably untrue, the other media organisation just to be able to get standing in court, to be able to go through that process of discovery, in order to put that legal and financial disincentive effect on the other side, right? So what that means is that there are lots of high risk, high reward, socially desirable stories that no longer get reported on, and that's really, really bad. But that's especially bad for start-up new news organisations that provide valuable intellectual diversity to our media environment, because one, they have limited amounts of capital, so they're likely to be more scared of getting legal financial damage in court. But secondly, in order to break out into the mainstream and get people wherever you are, you often have to have your big breakout moment, like Newsroom had to have their big breakout moments this year. But those big breakout movements tend to err into the subjectivity zone, or tend to err into the instances we were talking to anonymous sources. There is a lot of grey area and a lot of wiggle room, and it's likely that big media organisations are just going to use this to shit on other people, proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for the speech, and invite up the government for one.
Thrust of the extension we just heard was just there's a lot of complicated legal issues, and the legal system doesn't know how to deal with complicated legal issues. And I think it was pretty reasonably clear that there are ways that the legal system does get around complicated legal issues. For example, if we want to take Joe's example of a Me Too story, okay, so somebody is consulted with two sources that gets published, maybe somebody takes you to court, right? If you've consulted with your sources and you're reasonably sure and you've met the reasonable journalist standard, you're not going to get sued for whatever this tort is now called, right? Because you've met that reasonable standard, you've consulted with your sources properly, and you won't misleading, publishing misleading information on purpose or negligently or recklessly, right? So we think that the court system obviously has a fine way to deal with this through the inherent way that this legislation will be set up. But what I really wanted to talk about in my speech was the extension we didn't think was properly dealt with across the bench, right? Which is what happens when you can't place yourself in the world and you can't connect to reality, right? Because I think this harm was kind of washed over by opposition bench, because if you literally do not know what is real or not, that has some huge psychological harms on you beyond just being able to debate with people on the same ground, because you literally cannot distinguish reality in your own mind is extremely psychologically damaging. It's very isolating when you're unable to just turn on the news and just not even be able to trust what you see up there, because the benefits of being able to trust the mainstream media, and we don't think that stuff like 4chan and Reddit was relevant, because your average suburban mum doesn't just flick on Reddit to see what's up with the world, right? Beyond actually being able to debate with people on the same grounds, at least you can understand where they're coming from. So maybe they think that a different solution to poverty actually works, and you think that it doesn't work. At least you're starting from the same ground, and you actually understand the level playing field that you're starting from, right? No. So we say it's very inherently stressful, because you can never actually hold an opinion when your entire ground is unstable, unless, of course, you just dogmatically accept the facts that you just kind of think are real because they align with your opinion. That's another harm of this debate, right? Because either you're lost in a sea of ideas and you're unable to literally find up from down, or you have to dogmatically just stick to what you decide is the truth. That can put you in a lot of friction with other people in the world. They can distort your ideas of the world. That's really bad. We don't think that was ever engaged with across the bench. But now let's deal with some of the other problems that people had in the debate. I'll take opening.
So Siobhan told you that courts in the US are deeply and increasingly partisan. Is it wise to give them the power to censor or punish media organizations when those organizations are our best defense against the real source of fake news, politicians?
Okay, so there's a couple of responses here, right? So we think firstly that like lower courts are unlikely to be as like massively partisan as you're talking about. The Supreme Court is like a massive outlier. That's fine. The second thing here is that like you're concerned with the media not being able to criticize politicians, but we think it's actually better like when we can't allow news organizations to just publish politician statements as if they are truth. They now have to actually present that as like this is a statement that like is an opinion and may or may not be true, or they actually have to fact check that opinion and they have to do that critical analysis on like that statement. Otherwise they can't publish it, and otherwise they might be liable to pay a great sum of money. So we think like that was always that was fine, right? Let's actually talk about the efficacy of this model, right? Because there was a lot of contentions coming from Joe about like, oh, this it just kind of like won't work. It's really hard to take people from court. Like people don't really have a lot of money. The first thing to say is that like the claims don't actually like have to work all the time. Basically, you just have to take down like a big dog once, give them a slap on the wrist, and then like everyone else is going to follow suit because they see the threat and the potential of like what's actually going to happen. So if you have one high-profile case, you then create the incentive for all media organizations to change and to fact check. The second thing to say here is that like obviously it's not just like watchdogs that can like sue media corporations. Like if Fox News is like slating CNN, then like CNN can also just like sue Fox for fake news as well, because if they're saying that like CNN's wrong, you're gonna settle the truth of the matter by like taking it to court, right? So you get actually to dwindle out the actual objective truth of that like ideological battle there.
On that.
But in terms of watchdogs, right, it's like, oh, people are never going to vote like to give money to watchdogs when there's like children down the road that need education. But the thing is, like, I think a lot of people probably actually would vote on that basis. Like we see, like especially in America, there's a whole bunch of like right-wing people who would love to rein in CNN, and then on the alternative, a whole bunch of like left-wing people who would love to rein in Fox News, which I see as one of the like biggest dangers to democracy ever. So it's a really bipartisan issue that people can actually get votes and get a mandate on. We didn't think that was a problem. Okay.
On that.
I'll take one from opening.
So if every mainstream media organization in the US constantly has multiple lawsuits in progress against them, and these lawsuits are reported on, what do you think that does to public perception of the media?
Like, I think this was already dealt with at opening, right? But I'll whip it up again for you. Is that when you have like a rigorous system that is dealing with all of the falsehoods in the media, you probably feel confident and good that media organizations are going through this legal system and out the other side. So you know that the news that you're getting is true, and you know that the news you're getting is reliable. And this was always the most important for those like mainstream media news organizations that your mum watches and your grandma watches, because it is that like basis and that like shared set of reality that allows people to cooperate and allows people to have a grounding in the world. So we think of course that was always going to be the most important part of this debate. In terms of more niggly problems about trust, we think obviously again the legal system can deal with sources and keep them quiet in court and have just the judge and the sources in a special little room and have them in witness protection or whatever it is. The legal system can deal with this sort of stuff. So at the end of the day, this obviously was going to work as a mechanism. It was going to make sure that people could trust the media. They wouldn't be so psychologically destroyed upside down in a world where they didn't know what was true and what wasn't. We're proud to give people some grounding in the world so we could agree on at least what the facts were.
I thank the speaker for a speech, and I invite the final speaker in today's debate, the opposition leader.
It is difficult enough to come forward to a reporter with a story about the fact that you've been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted by a public person. The idea that those kinds of people could be put up on the stand and told, like, yelled at by like reporters from Fox News or by lawyers on behalf of whomever, like who is suing that media company. The idea that those people should have to suffer through that is politically poisonous. And the reason why it is poisonous is because those stories simply will not get told. Because the reality is that it is not always the case that the important stories that the public needs to hear have like people that are willing to come forward. Sometimes it is the case that the evidence that people that are reporting on the goings on in the Middle East is somewhat shaky. And those are exactly the sorts of stories that like news sources are likely to pull back on, but they're exactly the sorts of stories that people need to hear. So I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. First, I'm going to work through the extension that we've heard. Secondly, about competition in the media market. Lastly, about the types of stories that get run. Firstly, let's talk about the extension. And note here that the stuff that has come out from closing government is contingent upon their policy actually being successful in like chopping out a large proportion of the news, right? So we think that like, given that the rest of my speech is going to be proving why that's not the case, that they're going to like drop reasonably far down the rankings on the basis of that, right? The second thing that we say here is like, of course everyone having the same facts is good, right? Like that's uncontroversial. We're never going to have a debate about that. The problem is that like, it's not just about the facts that you have. Like they've even said it. It's about the spin on the facts, right? Like it doesn't matter if like two people have the same facts. If one of them is watching Fox and Friends and the other is watching CNN with like each of their like demagogues like talking crap about the same facts. Like that's not what's important. And we don't think like it's going to be, we think in fact your opinions inform the facts. We think therefore what's most important is we're able to have diversity of opinion on those facts. So what do we think about in terms of competition? And the first thing to say here is that what Joe told you is that it is politically unviable to find the funding to take on Fox News, which is a humongous enterprise that is like, watchdogs are going to find it very difficult to find the funding. And the response here was just like, oh, you can just like go out and like convince people that Fox needs to be sued, and like people will vote for politicians to do that. But like, it seems like the policy here is like Democrats versus Fox News, right? Like it seems like now Democrats come out and campaign on a policy of we're going to fund watchdogs that are going to go out and sue Fox News. So like, what I think is demonstrated by our opening team like reasonably conclusively is that the problem here isn't actually lies, right? Because they haven't pointed to lies that Fox News tells, because they don't tell lies, right? The problem is they take the facts and they twist them. That is exactly the problem. So what we tell you is that the actual biggest issue that we have is polarization. So if your idea is to like set up Democrats versus Fox News, that is going to lead to polarization. That is exactly what leads to Republicans like being entirely refusing to listen to the sorts of things that CNN. Why does this matter? It's because in the absence of these watchdogs, who uses this law? The massive media companies take on the little guys, right? They weaponize the law. They bog them down in mountains of paperwork that they simply do not have the resources to fight. They take on those companies and weaponize that law. What does that mean? A few things. Firstly, it means that people who suffer from the fact that small media companies destroyed do not get full coverage. But more importantly, it's the stuff that Joe analysed that we didn't get a response to. It's the fact that those small companies often have to work off the base of risky stories, right? You have to have newsroom that comes out and reports on Jamie Lee Ross and those sorts of things to build ground and to become competitive with the big news sources. They're not able to, no thank you, Keir. They're not able to like run those stories in the first place because they're scared, but like they're certainly not able to when they have big like news groups breathing down their neck. When we lack those groups, when all we have are CNN and Fox News, you lose intellectual diversity. And that is important because what is most important in news today is removing polarization. And the way that you do that is by having reasoned discussion from a number of different viewpoints, not just by having like two massive monoliths who like dictate the way that people think. No thank you. So, let's talk about what stories get run. And like just to note here again, well, can I have some water by the way? Yeah, I'll take you. Can I have some water from someone?
Newsroom does incredibly well, thorough research sources that can be protected in the court of law like many sexual assault victims do. Why then would they be worried about a claim that would obviously be thrown out at the first stage in court?
Because I just reject your premise that that is the case. Like that's just not the case for lots of things, right? If you want to run a story about like the caliphate or whatever, you just cannot have that certainty. Moreover, I'm going to talk about some more stuff on that. So, the first thing to note at the top of this point is that it has just been like assumed in this debate that Fox lies, right? And that like those news companies lie. And I mentioned it before, but like Joe gave you lots of reasons why they wouldn't lie, right? It's because people want viewership and they want credibility. They want their reporters to be able to go into places and people want to talk to those reporters and run stories with those reporters. News media requires credibility in order to maintain its power and maintain its profitability. So, two important things to talk about in terms of the stories that run. And I flagged like some of this stuff before, but there is important stuff that needs to be run in the media. And often that incorporates unwilling witnesses. And often that incorporates scenarios such as like a large proportion of Me Too cases where there is a low standard of evidence that would not pass by in a court of law. You would not be able to get through. Or, alternatively, that side of the house lets those things get through, and in which case they do absolutely nothing at all. Why do we think it's bad? Because people don't do the stories, and because it particularly hurts the smaller news media. Secondly, what do we think is a massive problem in the scenario? Yes, Keir, I'll take it.
What do you think would hurt the Me Too movement more? It being found that a rushed story published was fake and so people writing the whole movement off, or the news taking a few days longer to make sure everything is correct?
But they can't, Keir. They can't make someone who has just come out for being sexually assaulted go on the stand. That's the point. We can't do that. That's the whole issue. And even if you could, no one funds it, right? Like, anyway, okay, like our case. All right, so, second thing to talk about is shutting down the pipeline. And what we tell you is that the main sources of fake news are things like Russian trolls and people on 4chan. That side of the house is like virtually conceded that they don't do anything to stop that. So, like, why is that a problem? It's because, like, you can't control the little guys, right? If you're Fox News, you cannot control the pipeline that feeds you news from local news sources. So the extent of their case is you just pull that back totally, right? You go from slow news to you only report your own stories. And that's terrible, right? Because that's Fox News only reporting stories that Fox News comes up with. That's like, you know, like news sources who are already incredibly polarized, only running the stories that they decide are the ones that they want to look into, and only running the stories that are the ones that they want to fund. That is when you get bias. That is when you get polarization within the political system. What we tell you is that the most important thing that we need to do is to have intellectual diversity, to have the stories that matter coming out, and to allow for smaller news sources to continue. This is a policy that destroys all of those lofty goals. We stand in opposition.